If you've not signed in, should I pass the sign-in sheet around? Is anyone missing? That's
Beautiful family bond.
4 boys.
Oh, thank you.
How do you sleep?
The oldest one's 9, so I haven't in like 9 years. I'm an associate professor of economics. Excited to talk about causal inference, which you can also call casual inference. I make that mistake all the time. Yeah, well, I mean, we'll see how long I talk for. Generally, what we want to do is talk about what is causal inference, why it's important in statistical analysis, and then kind of the modern methods that we use in economics. And I thought this was interesting because I was, trying to guess kind of where y'all's abilities are at, and I assume y'all are pretty comfortable with handling data. But I was wondering if maybe kind of inference is something that we could have a fun conversation about. Like what you do once you have the data set that's clean and it's ready to go, how can you make statements about the world? And so what we're going to do is just do a really kind of quick, pretty boring review of regressions and the assumptions and why they fail, and then how economists have developed tools to do that. And I will, of course, interject lots of what I consider to be interesting research along the way. All right, so causal inference. Basically, what we're trying to do is trying to establish causal relationships between two variables. For instance, do more cops cause crime to drop? Okay. Does sleeping your baby on his or her tummy cause SIDS? Okay. Do more guns lead to more crime? Do undocumented immigrants lead to more unsafe cities? Right. So these are questions that we're trying to answer and assign a direction of causality. Right. Does sleeping your baby on his stomach, does that cause SIDS? Does it actually cause SIDS, or is it just correlated? All right. So for instance, like some data that I pulled today, if you look at cops and crime, Detroit has 35 cops per 10,000 of the population, and they have 1,700 violent crimes per 10,000 of the population. Compare that to Provo, Utah, which is the neighborhood my parents live. There's 8 cops per 10,000, and there's 149 violent crimes per 100,000 of the population. Right? Is the fact that they have not a lot of cops in Provo mean that the results in there's not a lot of crime, or is the fact that Detroit has a lot of crimes mean there's a lot of cops, right? It's hard to decide which direction the causality is going. There we go. So is this causal direction correct? So more cops lead to more crimes. Does that make sense to you? Is there something that might potentially be missing from this model? Like, does anything else matter to crime other than the number of cops? If the answer is yes, then you would think that maybe it's so. And we laugh about it, but there's a lot of times we read stuff, especially in popular press, that will make kind of like these ad hoc observations like they're really important, right? Like the rise, like the relationship between vaccines and autism. Right, there'll be these really fun infographics that show that the two things are moving together. So clearly, vaccinations are causing autism, right? And you see that and you immediately think like, well, I don't know, should I get should I get my kids vaccinated? So this stuff is presented pretty regularly in the popular press, and so economists are trying really hard to kind of flesh this out. The one that I love to talk about is the Back to Sleep program and SIDS. How are you supposed to sleep your baby? How are you supposed to, if you have a child who's under the age of 1, how are they supposed to sleep at night?
On their back.
On their back. Why?
They're not strong enough to lift themselves up.
Because they're not strong enough to prop their necks up or something like that. Why do you do that? Because the American Academy of Pediatrics in 1994 said you should do that. Right? That's why you do it. So I have 4 boys. They were all babies once. And every single time we met with the pediatrician for the first time, I didn't want to really aggressively push the issue because it's, it's our child's pediatrician, but I would kind of ask and be like, why do we sleep children on their backs? And they're like, oh, to prevent SIDS. And I'm like, what is the available research that suggests this relationship? And they're like, it's to avoid SIDS. Like, do you want your baby to die? Sleep them on its back. So from this webpage, you can look and they say they initiated this program in 1994, and they found that since they initiated this program, SIDS has decreased by 2,000 cases. Okay? So that's one of my children. This is the first one, I think. So we increased back sleeping, and then all of a sudden SIDS dropped. Does that necessarily establish a causal relationship? Is there something else missing from the model? Spoiler alert, there is. Okay, and we'll come back to it. All right, so why is establishing empirically testing these lines of causality, why is this difficult in real life? And the problem is, and you all probably can feel this in your bones, is that we're dealing with the difference between experimental and observational data. All right, so when you have, like experimental data, for instance, would be, say I have this research question, and does getting kicked in the chest lead to physical discomfort, right? How would I test this out, right? How would you test this out? Well, you would establish, you pull from the population, you randomly pull from the population, and you assign a treatment group, and that group gets kicked in the chest, right? And then you would have a control group, and they don't get kicked in the chest, okay? And this actually happened in the World Cup a couple years ago. So that's now with De Jong. That was like a flying kick to Xabi Alonso's chest. And miraculously wasn't a red card. It didn't make any sense, right? So how would you do this? You calculate the average pain in these two groups, and then you would just measure the difference in means, right? Because you have randomly assigned the kicking mechanism, you randomly assign the treatment, then you can say with confidence that the direction of causality is you get kicked in the chest, and you're going to experience some chest comfort, all right? Problem is that experimental data, while ideal, it's not feasible. It's not feasible in lots of really, really important questions dealing with all sorts of things. Okay, so kind of what we're looking for is, can we establish causal lines in these questions that we have to use secondary observational data that we get after the event has happened or after the data has been collected? Can we mimic a laboratory setting without necessarily this random assignment? All right, so to do that, we're going to, the methods that economists use to try and get at that is some form of linear regression. Okay, so hopefully real quick review. So this is an equation of a line. All right, y is the outcome, called dependent variable, whatever. X is the predictor, the control independent variable. Lots of names for the same thing. Beta naught's the y-intercept. Beta 1 is the slope that measures the relationship. And u here is the error term. This is the unexplained variation in y. It's the noise. It's everything, all the rest of the variation in y that's not explained by x. Okay. This regression, it carries a set of 5 assumptions to it. The first one is that the relationship between y and x is linear in nature. That means you increase x by 1, and it will have a proportion increase in y over all values of x. When might this assumption be violated? For instance, how long you've been in a job and your productivity. Right, so if you're looking at productivity is your y and your x is your job tenure, the first couple of months, or say the first couple of years, you get progressively much, much better at your job, right? You get on-the-job training, you get the hang of things, but by the time you've been at your job 10, 15 years, does the 15th year, does that improve your productivity the same that the first year did? No, right? So these are nonlinear. This is a nonlinear relationship. In linear regression, we are assuming linearity in the relationships, right? It'd also be the same thing if you look at the returns to schooling. Like, how much does schooling affect your future earnings, right? Going from 2nd to 3rd grade is probably not as important as going from like 11th to 12th grade. Right, so you probably have a greater return finishing high school than, going from 3rd to 4th grade or something like that. All right, so regularly violated. Second assumption is random sampling and from the population. So when is this violated? Like a lot. And this manifests itself in different situations that we call self-selection, sorting, stuff like that. Basically, a lot of times when we are handed secondary data, multiple regression assumes that people randomly enter that data set. But almost never is that the case. People self-select in the data sets. Like right now, this group of people is a self-selected group. This is not a random slice of Birmingham. Right? You all voluntarily chose to come here, and that creates issues. And that creates issues that we try really hard to address, but it creates issues nonetheless. Okay. The third assumption is that we have enough variation in X, and this gets tricky in what constitutes enough. A lot of stuff that I do in my research deals with state changes to state laws. So if we have like one state change its law with, say, decriminalizing indoor sex work, which is something we'll talk about, is that enough change? What if 5 states change laws about mental health commitment requirements? Is that enough change? That really varies. It varies question to question, and it's really hard to pin down. Assumption 4 is a zero conditional mean, which is essentially that the error term, which is the unexplained variation in y, conditional on x is equal to 0. We can simplify this without loss of generality to this equation right here, which is basically saying that the unexplained variation in y is uncorrelated with your x. Okay? So that's an independence requirement, and all it's saying is that they are unrelated. And then it's oftentimes violated. An example might be if your y is the homicide rate and your x is the stock of guns in a society. What might be included in the error term, the unexplained variation, might be the number of cops, right? So homicide rate surely has to do with the number of guns in society, but also probably has to, a bunch of other stuff matters, including the number of cops available. That number of cops. If it is the case that the number of cops is, so this is the condition that must hold, and that is that the number of cops conditional on a city that has lots of guns is equal to the number of cops conditional on a city that has fewer guns. And that's not, that probably won't hold. That will not hold. I should say that more definitively. That is an assumption that is violated. Okay. And last is homoscedastic error terms. That's boring. It's a pretty easy fix. We won't talk about it. I mean, more boring than everything else. Okay. All right, so return to the question, can we establish these causal lines with a laboratory setting, without a laboratory setting in random assignment? The answer is yes, if all 5 assumptions are met, which they are mostly not, and if not, we got to do some work. Okay, so let me give you an example of some studies where these linear regression assumptions are violated. Okay. First example I want to give is orchestra auditions and gender. So this is a really, really important study by Claudia Golding in the year 2000. So for those of you who aren't keenly familiar, which includes me, about the way that orchestras work, prior to 1970, if there was a vacancy in the orchestra, what would happen is it wouldn't necessarily be advertised, posted like a regular job. The director would have someone in mind who they wanted to hire, and they would reach out to that person, maybe a couple more people, then they would bring them in, listen to them play, then they would get the position. Okay? And it was made by a single individual. So the question is, can we establish a causal line, put casual there, a causal line between the probability that you get the job and how well you play the song, or that is this equation? We would like to say, is there some sort of causality between how well you play the song and whether or not you get the job? You would hope that the answer is yes, right? But just based on the way that it worked prior to 1970, can you see potential problems? Like what might be potential problems?
Whether you're known by the director or not.
Surely we're not looking at a random sample from the population of violinists, right? You have to be known by the director. So right away that assumption's violated. What else? Think 1960s, virtually all the directors were men. What do you imagine is happening?
Picking men.
Yeah, they're picking men. There's this really important thing that, I evangelize about in every opportunity that I get, and that is implicit bias. Okay, so there's explicit bias, and that's the type of bias that occurs because you just don't like people, and you don't like the way they look or the way they talk or the way they act, right? And that's bad, right? We sometimes call it discrimination, we sometimes call it racism. We all agree it's bad. There's this other brand of bias, however, called implicit bias that we observe in really, really careful studies like this one. And what that is that we are naturally, humans are generally, they tend towards people who look and talk and act like them. So when you're hiring for a job, a lot of times, and I've been in these interviews before, where we will interview someone and they'll say all the right questions, then they'll hang up, and the group that's deciding whether or not to hire them will say stuff like, I just don't know if they're a good fit, or there's something intangible about that person that I just didn't feel like it would work with me. Right? We interviewed a guy once who talked really funny and had like a really big goatee. It went like down to here. And after he hung up on the Skype call, everyone in the room was like, he said all the right questions, but I'm just not sure he would be a good fit. I'm not sure he would work here. Right? What's happening? He doesn't look like us. He didn't talk like us. He had a weird voice. And so he was different. And so we kind of just tended away from him. Right? We do this. Right? We all do this. We tend towards people that kind of look and talk and act like us. And this is this implicit bias. And the first step to breaking it is realizing that we all do it. Okay? This is happening here, right? There's this implicit bias. Even if the directors have no intention to discriminate against anyone, subconsciously a lot of times that they do it. So they do this a lot of times. Okay? So right away in that study, and we'll come back to that study, those lots of assumptions are violated there. So we're gonna have a hard time drawing causal lines there. All right, let's go back to sleep and SIDS. There was a paper written in 2008 by Sarah Markowitz, who's at Emory, and she was looking at, can we establish this causal line between the Back to Sleep program and SIDS, like the American Academy of Pediatrics claims. So basically, the regression that they're trying to figure out is, was it the probability that you get SIDS? That's a function of whether or not you're sleeping the baby on the back. Okay. So from Sarah Markowitz's paper, here is the SIDS rate per 1,000 live births. Does anyone remember what year they started the Back to Sleep program? It was like 6 slides earlier. 1994. Right away, what do you notice is like happening to SIDS before the Back to Sleep program? What?
It's declining.
It's already going down. All right, so the way that a simple linear regression might work, or a difference in means, is if you wanted to say, what's the effect of this policy, this is how essentially a regression would do it. It would take the average of this line, which is going to put us like right about here, right? And it would compare it to the average of this line, which is going to put us right about here, and it's going to measure that jump. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if you do that regression and you measure that jump, what do you see?
See a drop.
You see a drop. You say, oh, SIDS is going down because of this back to sleep program. Okay. So Sarah comes along and says, I don't think that's the case, right? And this is not her. She did not have this original idea. She was told. There was some medical literature that said that the association is not necessarily sleeping on the back, but rather, does anyone know?
Cigarette.
Yeah, cigarettes. Yeah, yeah. Let's label on the bottom. So, cigarette pricing, right? So, cigarette prices go down, SIDS go up, cigarettes go down, they kind of move inversely, right? This is her story. That's child number 2. Okay, you'll notice all my children are sleeping on their stomach. They're much happier, they don't fuss as much. My first child was born in 2010. I first heard this paper presented in 2008. I was pretty confident in the results. Okay. All right, so how can we establish...
Hey, going back to that for a moment.
Yeah.
I kind of sort of took that as a joke, that the cigarette price was related to the births. Is that the real...
That's the story. And I'll finish the story later in the presentation, but that is the story. And so what Sarah does is, instead of looking at cigarette prices, she looks at the changes to cigarette taxes, because there's some might argue that maybe these two are interrelated. Maybe one is causing the other, maybe the other is causing one, maybe there's some unobserved variable. But her argument is, if we look at cigarette taxes, who changes those laws? Those are changes by legislation by legislators. surely they were not thinking this is a good program to stop SIDS, right? So so the idea is that this is kind of like what we call an exogenous shock to cigarette consumption. So you use the taxes, so you raise the price of cigarettes, people smoke cigarettes less. You might not think that's the case, but that is actually established in the literature that cigarette smokers are responsive to changes in price. We all know people who are like chain smokers who will smoke as much as they want to smoke without thought to price, but the vast majority of us who smoke are responsive to price. Okay, so she uses cigarette taxes as a proxy for the price of cigarettes and finds this to be the case. It's interesting. I think it's interesting stuff. So what can we do? As economists, as applied analysts, we can try and just conduct an experiment. Okay, and economists do this occasionally. There's a pretty famous experiment called altruistic punishment in humans. Right, so it tries to answer the question, why do we do nice things for people? Right, so there's some prevailing theories that it's kin selection, right? Like we're thinking about future mates, and so that's why we do nice things, or we expect some sort of reciprocity if we do a nice thing. So I help you because I know you're going to help me, and in fact, people say that, right? Like if you help someone out, they're like, oh, I need you to do the same for me, like they say stuff like that. Or there's some sort of reputation effects or repeated interaction effects. You try to look like a nice person because you know you're probably going to see these people again, right? You can't be a jerk with people you know that you're going to see every Sunday at church, for instance. Okay? But we still observe a lot of times people do nice things that they never meet again, right? So why does this happen, right? Why is it that people do nice things that they never see again? And it could just be the case that doing the nice thing is really low cost, right? So you see someone walks out of the store and their wallet falls to the ground. You pick up their wallet and you run and you flag them down and say, hey, here's your wallet, and you never see them again. That's just really low cost, and maybe that you did that. But sometimes it's pretty costly. So what they did is they designed a lab experiment. So they just sat students down in a room and they did this thing where they played what's called a public goods game. And just real quick, the way the public goods game works is everyone in the room, say I give you $10, you all get to decide how much you contribute to the pot, okay? And you keep what you don't contribute, but what gets contributed to the pot doubles, and then gets split between everyone. Not everyone who contributed, but to everyone, right? So hopefully you're immediately thinking, how do you game the system? And the way that it does is you convince everyone else to contribute their money, but you hold back your own money, right? So then you get like the spoils of the money doubling, but then you also keep your original money, okay? So what they do is they play this public goods game, but they give a provision to where at the end, if someone free rides and doesn't contribute, you are allowed to punish them. You're allowed to take away $1 of theirs, and it costs you $3 to do so. And what they find is that people actually do this. They actually spend money to punish the free rider for no other reason other than to send a message that you shouldn't do this again in the future, is what they argue. Because they played the game once, and then they scrambled people, and they played the game again. And across time, people consistently use their money to punish people. And the argument that they give is that the reason you do it is it just makes you feel good. Right? Like, yeah, you got screwed over because you contributed and that person did it, but you got to pay money to teach them a lesson. Okay? So in some cases you can do this, right? But lots of really important questions, we just kind of have to observe the data in the wild, as they say, as opposed to creating a lab scenario where you can toy with things. All right. So back to the sleep program. Back to sleep program. Again, Sarah Markowitz's idea is that if you increase cigarette taxes, that will lead to less cigarettes being smoked. That's pretty established in the literature, and then maybe that's how we draw this causal relationship between smoking and SIDS. Okay. With the orchestral auditions, Clara Golden and Charlotte Ruse, they said, we can't create a lab experiment where we bring in the conductors and we bring in the people auditioning for it, but is there some sort of natural experiment? Is there some sort of naturally occurring phenomena that is as good as random? And it turns out that there is. So like we said, pre-1970, it was a pretty biased system, but between the 1970s and 1980s, people realized that this was a biased system, and what they did is a lot of orchestras, they started putting a screen in front of the person who was auditioning. And in other situations, they would have them just listen from another room. So if you're auditioning for a part or for a place, you would go to another room, you would play in a microphone, and then the panel would listen from another room. Okay, so these are like these are the 5 biggest symphonies in the US. You can see between 1940 and 1960, 1970, there's very, very little change in the proportion of females in the orchestra. And once they start doing these blind experiments, these blind auditions, what happens? What happens? Women actually, turns out they can play the violin and other things, right? And they start, with much higher frequency, they start getting hired. Okay? This is a really cool example of like a naturally occurring experience. We're able to establish this causal line because there was this thing that they did, and after the fact, we're able to be like, aha, that is kind of like they ran their own experiment. Y'all see what I'm saying? It's kind of like they ran their own experiment. Another example of a natural experiment. So undocumented immigrants and crime. This is like very topical, right? And very close to my heart because when I was in graduate school, I got my master's and my PhD at Emory University in Atlanta, and during the summers I would stand off, there's a Home Depot off Lawrenceville Highway, and a lot of day laborers who are typically undocumented immigrants, they would stand outside Home Depot and do day labor. And I didn't have a job, and I didn't have anything to do during the summers, and so I would stand outside. I speak Spanish because I was in Spain for a couple of years, so I would stand outside and I would, pick up the same jobs that these undocumented workers did. And so I have a special place in my heart for undocumented immigrants, especially in the United States, because I got to know and they became my friends, right? So now there's this conversation, there's a pretty strong narrative in the U.S. right now about the relationship between undocumented immigrants and crime. So we would love to be able to establish some sort of causal relationship between undocumented immigrants and crime. Are undocumented immigrants causing increases in crime? And right now, it really just depends on like what your, political colors are is how you answer that question, right? But from an economist's point of view, from a causal inference point of view, it's really kind of a tricky question to answer. Why? Where do undocumented immigrants typically settle?
Large cities.
In large cities. What do large cities have? They have crime. So if you just look at the correlation between the concentration of undocumented immigrants and crime, what would you see? You look at a positive correlation. The more undocumented immigrants, the more crime, right? But are they actually the ones committing the crime? Are they actually causing more crime? All right, so one way that a couple folks have tried to address this question is not just to look at the correlations, because that's kind of, that's really sloppy. So this paper, published in 2013, what they did is they looked at what they call 2 exogenous waves of immigrants. So they looked at these waves of immigrants that came into the UK that really had nothing to do with crime in the UK. The first was asylum seekers from war-torn African countries. So this happened in 2001. There was a lot of civil unrest in Africa. It was really dangerous, and so there was just an influx. There's a huge flow of asylum seekers in the UK. The United Kingdom had the most asylum seekers, save one country, which was not the United States, in this year. Right, do y'all see where this is going? So you have this weird, huge flux of asylum seekers in 2001. Okay? There's another event that happens in 2004, and that is 8 countries joined the European Union, and the UK allows them, through a work visa process, allows these countries to work in the UK, right? So, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia are not particularly poor countries. but Slovakia, I mean, so these are not like really wealthy countries, so probably people are flowing in from the UK. So they're using these two events as almost like it were an experiment. What we would love to do is we would love to, I don't know, go to London and then randomly in different neighborhoods drop asylum seekers in the different neighborhoods. And then measure crime in those neighborhoods relative to the neighborhoods that didn't get the asylum seekers, and then measure those difference in means, right? Kind of like the kicking in the chest experiment. We don't get to do that in real life in most cases. So what we have to do is we have to try and think really carefully about outside circumstances that have led to similar sort of natural experiments. All right, so where do you guess the results are?
My guess is immigrants do not cause crime.
That is 100% true. The first wave led to a small but significant rise in property crime. The second wave led to a small negative impact, which means crime went down. Right, so the first wave, there was a small increase in property crime. The second wave, there was actually a reduction in property crimes, and there was never any effect on violent crime. And I will tell you, this has been repeated in the United States with different sorts of changes to immigration laws from flows from Mexico and Central America. And almost uniformly, there is no evidence to suggest, any sort of careful analysis to suggest that immigrants are causing higher crimes. If anything, typically, undocumented immigrants are associated with lower levels of crime, which makes sense because if you're undocumented in the United States, you're trying to earn money and trying to stay out of trouble. Okay. Last natural experiment that we'll talk about. This is a paper by Matt Harris and friends. He's at Tennessee. Okay. So the question that they're trying to ask is, how does Army local police with military-grade tactical equipment affect citizen complaints, officer assaults, and bad stuff like that? Right. So the natural experiment that they exploit is what's called the 1033 program, and the 1033 program is essentially a program that the U.S. government enacted that took military-grade equipment used by the Department of Defense. They decommissioned it, so it's not of a level of quality that the Department of Defense wants, but still functions just fine. So instead of just burning it and getting rid of it, what they did is they said, we are going to put it in a bunch of different warehouses, and we're going to let local law enforcement agencies have whatever they want. Okay? So Matt Harris's idea was, there are only... So the idea is, like, what happens if we give cops, like, AR-15s and sniper rifles and bazookas and grenade launchers, which are all things that they were able to get. What happens when you give these to cops, right? You can see it really going either way, right? Like if a cop rolls up to your house and is like super strapped, you might be like, yo, I'm not doing anything wrong. We're cool. You're cool. I'm cool, right? But on the other hand, could you see people reacting negatively to that?
Well, so the cops, right?
Yeah.
Change their mentality.
It might change the cop's mentality, right? It might change the interaction between, the civilians and law enforcement. It might change a lot of different things. And so what they wanted to do is they said, let's see how this relationship changes, if it changes at all. And we can do this because while everyone is free to get all this equipment, the local law enforcement agency had to pay.
There's a
7
shutdown.
7 o'clock. Nice.
That was a big deal in the news. I remember in 17 when they had the news. I don't remember where there was a riot. And you'd see that military-grade equipment when they were trying to control the people.
And you think to yourself, like, how does this affect? Like, how does this affect this interaction, right? So what do y'all think? Do you think it was better or worse?
I would say worse.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It depends on the psychology of the group, I guess. Because if you have a group, I mean, I don't know about current times, but I'm a big Mahatma Gandhi fan, and I mean, they used to face military grade, crowd control all the time, and you had very peaceful protests occur. So I mean, it's just the mentality of the crowd is what's driving that group mentality.
So, okay, so what about this? So say that you're having like a mental health episode. You're at your home and you're feeling mentally ill, you're feeling potentially suicidal, you have a firearm. This is a common occurrence, right? What do? Lots of people just call the police.
Yeah.
Or a friend or a neighbor or a family member calls the police and says, hey, we need some help, okay? Which is unfortunate because most police departments don't train at all on how to deal with mental health.
Yeah.
Right? And so you have cops that come into a situation and they don't know how to deal with it. You have someone who's highly suicidal with a deadly firearm and they don't really know how to do it. So in that case, what do you think would happen? So you give cops, like tactical gear and a high-powered rifle, and you have them show up to the person's house who's suffering from a mental health episode. How do you think that might change the
That's
dynamic?
probably, yeah, I mean, that's a situation where you're putting two people that have no idea what the hell's going on in a volatile situation. They're fearing for their lives, so, you know.
Yeah.
It's gonna make it more aggressive, it's gonna escalate the problem. That's, I would think is pretty obvious.
But it's also, I think there's also a level of like, I don't know if you can say desensitization. Like if I'm a cop and now I got all this gear, I'm gonna think in my head that in the other side of that door there is somebody else with exactly the same type of gear that I got, where that person does not have access to that type of stuff. But yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
I would think you make it more volatile.
Yeah, you make it almost like, so if you feel like cops have God complexes, like that's just gonna make it worse, right? So what Harris found is that actually they're the opposite. He found that his results were generally positive. There were lower complaints filed, lower assaults on police officers, and generally lower citizen deaths.
So did he have the answer as to why it was lower?
Well, so he made a mistake, and I think...
That's interesting.
And this is, so he made a mistake, and this is the, and this is kind of like, this represents the boundaries or some of the shortcomings of when you think you have a natural experiment, okay? So the 1033 program, is it a true natural experiment? So I'm working on a paper right now with a friend. And what we did is we saw this paper and we thought, oh, this is really interesting. The results are kind of different than what I thought. And so we said we want to address this question of what happens when you have certain state laws that make it easier for those who are mentally ill to get a firearm, and at the same time you have cops who are more strapped, right? So it's kind of like an actual arms race, right? So what happens in this situation? And what we found is that when you give cops more guns, it doesn't really affect the amount to which people actually commit suicide. When you give cops more guns, it doesn't affect the frequency in which cops get shot. But when you give those who are mentally ill easier access to guns, cops get shot more frequently. But not just get shot more frequently, they get shot more frequently when they are making calls about someone who is what they term mentally deranged. And that is a terminology used by uniform, the UCR, the FBI's statistics reporting agency. Okay. But as we started to dig a little bit deeper, we realized that in Matt Harris's paper, they were just looking at the folks that got tactical gear. Okay? But as we dug deeper into the 1033 program, we realized that there's all sorts of stuff you could have gotten from the warehouse. Right? Like, yeah, you could have gotten a tank and a helicopter and an armored vehicle and an AR-15 and an M6 and a lot of Glocks, right? But also, there were blankets, there was office equipment, there were filing cabinets, there were computers, there were first aid equipment. There's all sorts of other stuff they could have gotten. So the whole premise of this paper is that we have this nice natural experiment where only people who are close to the warehouses actually get the stuff, and this is the variation that we use to describe this end result. But as you dig a little deeper, you have to stop and think to yourself, sure, in Birmingham, we could get some of that gear because we're physically close enough to the warehouse. But what we pull out of the warehouse is non-random, right? We make a conscious decision, guns over blankets. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
What they phrase as a natural experiment, we say, hey, we need to pump the brakes a little bit and think a little bit more carefully about that because there's some sort of unobserved factor in that U-term that we talked about in this regression that seems to be driving some police departments to get guns and other police departments to get filing cabinets and blankets and first aid kits and stuff like that. Okay? So there are limits to this natural experiment framework. So what do we do when we approach some of these limits, or when we don't have a clean natural experiment? One of the other methods that we use is called regression discontinuity, or RDD design. And what that essentially is we're going to isolate some sort of arbitrary cutoff and compare the outcomes around the cutoff. This is best explained by example. So the research question is, how does full-day kindergarten affect student test scores? Y'all might not realize this, but in a lot of places in the United States, kindergarten students don't go to a full day of school. My kids are at Cahaba Heights, and once they hit kindergarten, they left at 7:30 and they're home at 2:30. They had a full day of school. But my sister's kids who are in Utah, they go from like 8:30 till like 12:45. They have like a half day. And the idea is it allows them to like slowly integrate into school life. So this happens a lot. So the question is, how does full-day kindergarten, how might this affect student achievement, student test scores? So the regression that we would naturally run is, well, what's your test score as a function of whether or not did you attend full-day kindergarten? Is this a random sample though? How many assumptions would this regression violate? Who is going to opt into full-day kindergarten?
People at
Lower
work.
income.
People at work, potentially lower income people. If you think that your kid is really struggling and is, not super smart, but like you don't want to deal with it at home, would you opt into full-day kindergarten? Potentially, right? So we have like this non-random sorting of the kids who go to half day versus the kids who go to full day. By the way, all the education research suggests that very little matters to your child's achievement in grade school, except for whether or not the teacher is a first-year teacher. Okay, that matters a little bit. But the thing that matters the most out of any sort of achievement, does anyone want to guess? It's not pre-K. It's how involved the parents are. If the parental involvement is the number one indicator in how successful a child will be in grade school. Also, make sure you don't have a first-year teacher. But outside of that, all these other things, they really don't matter as much as how involved the parent is. Okay? So if we could figure out if full-day kindergarten matters, this would be a really important question, because right now the research says that really nothing matters except for, are you involved in your children's lives? Which, if you're feeling like super guilty right now, that was my intention.
But it's so in conflict with what teachers are saying nowadays, because me, so I'm Latino, of course, and like you're on top of your kids about homework, and all my kids is, my teachers don't leave you homework anymore. Like they don't give you homework for the weekend. They're like, it's because they've heard this thing that it doesn't matter what they do, which is not necessarily true. What they're saying is that the involvement, your involvement in your kid's life, your parents' involvement in the kid's schooling is what matters. That doesn't mean don't do homework, right? But the teachers are hearing it like, oh, research shows that homework doesn't matter. Only thing that matters is parental involvement, so let's stop doing homework. Like, well, no. What it's saying is you helping your kids with their homework, right? How involved are you in their learning? That's what matters. But yeah, I think most of the teachers at my kids' school, none of them assign homework because they have a record, it doesn't matter, right? Go spend time with your parents. That's not exactly what the research is saying, but you're close, right? Like, but you're close. Okay. So RDD, we're going to isolate some sort of arbitrary cutoff. All right, so here's a paper that I worked on. What we did is we looked at a school district that required a pretest. So every student below a fixed score on the pretest, they automatically got put in full-day kindergarten. So first, a week before kindergarten happens, you go in and you take a pretest, and it's identifying shapes and sounds. Can you write your name, letters? Like, the kids love it, right? It's just this fun test that they get to do, and then they add up a score, and everyone who got below a certain score, they have to go to full-day kindergarten. And everyone who got above the score, they go to half-day kindergarten. Okay? So what it does is it creates some sort of discontinuous break in full-day kindergarten.
right? So what we do here is we just center the child's score around 0. So 0 is the cutoff, because the cutoff changed class to class. So what we do is we center the child's score. Everyone who is below the cutoff score, they typically, there's some exceptions where they ended up not going to full day kindergarten, but typically everyone who is below the score, and if you're very low below the cutoff score, you go to full day kindergarten. And everyone who's above the score, they do not go to full day kindergarten. So what we do in this study is, to try and establish this causal line, is what we do here is we say, obviously, if we compare the scores to this entire group to the scores of this entire group, what are we going to see? These students are doing very, very well. These students are doing very, very poorly, right? So if you could just do it like a difference in means, or if you just run a normal regression, that's going to give you misleading results, right? Because of the non-random assignment into the two groups. So what we do here is we say, okay, let's look at this group right here. They just barely missed full day kindergarten, okay? Let's compare it to this group right here. They just barely were low achieving enough to get into kindergarten. So say that the score on the test, the cutoff score is a 16. This group right here got like a 15 or a 14. This group here got a 17. Because they just happened to randomly answer one question better, they missed the entire year of full day kindergarten. So the analysis is, let's compare this group to this group, right? It would not make any sense to compare this group to this group, right? Because these are really high achieving students. They did really well. I think 150 was near the max score. So these are kids who are already first grade ready before kindergarten even started, okay? And these are kids who are very, very, very underprepared. All right, so we would never compare them to see how the effect of full day kindergarten. We're looking right here at the cutoff, okay? And the assumption is that in any given day, you might score a couple of points higher or lower on an exam, right? So the difference between the two groups is just kind of random noise, but has really important implications for the entire school year. Does that make sense? Okay. So we do that, and then we track these kids. Okay, and we track them to the end of the end of kindergarten and the second grade and the fourth grade, and we see how does this full day intervention affect. And what we do is we look most importantly right here, right at the cutoff. So we're saying these are the kids that got full day kindergarten, and this is their average score on the post test. And these are the kids who just didn't get full day kindergarten, and this is their score on the post test. What do you see, or specifically, what do you don't see? There's no difference, right? They're very, very similar. So does, it's very smooth around the cutoff. So does full day kindergarten matter? At least not the way that they implemented it here. Yeah.
Does kindergarten matter?
Does kindergarten in general matter?
Yeah. 0 versus a half day.
That's a good question. So I don't know if this is the law I see in Alabama. In Georgia, you actually don't even have to go to kindergarten, right? So it's not compulsory till first grade.
In New Jersey, we have early start, and that doesn't matter.
Early start, yeah. There's Head Start programs, and yeah. It is difficult to establish causal lines in early childhood education, and there's a lot of really good researchers who are doing their best, but it's hard work. All right, let's talk another regression discontinuity design. This is something that I work on a bunch. It's criminal sentencing in Alabama. All right. In Alabama, every criminal conviction must carry a sentence. By law, if you get convicted of a felony, you must have a sentence. How long that sentence is and how you serve that sentence varies wildly depending on a lot of factors, including the judge. Okay. Prior to 2006, this opened the doors for all sorts of well-documented biases. So you could have a same judge who has a same fact pattern on an offender, convicted of the same crime, serving vastly different prison sentences. And if you're guessing what is the unobserved factor or what is the observed factor that seems to be driving these differences, anything that you guess is probably the case, right? Race plays an important role, gender plays an important role, how close the judge is to getting reelected. Do you all realize that you elect your judges in Alabama? Right, so if it's an election year and they want to look tough on crime, then that will ramp up prison sentences and stuff like that. And I think we all agree if you're convicted of a crime, you should probably serve some time. But it was the consensus of Alabama and the Alabama Sentencing Commission, which is the governing body over these sorts of issues. It was the consensus in the early 2000s that while everyone should serve time, we should try to do our best to make it kind of normalized and establish some sort of parity. Right? So if you have the exact same crime committed in the exact same time and you plead the exact same pleading, these two people should probably serve the same time. Right? So in order to establish that, what they did is they created what are called structured sentencing algorithms. And essentially, a lot of states do this. And Alabama picked it up but fairly late. Essentially what it is it's a spreadsheet. It's a worksheet. And they go through and you calculate, so you've been convicted of your crime, what level of crime was it? What class was it? Were you using a gun? Do you have priors? Was it committed near a school? Was alcohol involved? Kind of like basic things. And then from there you aggregate all this information and you get a score. Okay? And from that score, there is a rubric about how long the judge can sentence you. There's a high, there's a medium, and there's a low, based for every score. Right? The more heinous the crime, obviously, the bigger the window is. The lower level of the crime, the shorter it is. And this is really important still today. Did you all hear about the Department of Justice review of the Alabama prison system? It did not paint Alabama in good light, we'll say. They did a 2-year review of the Department of Corrections, and it was very, very negative. And they said you are violating the Constitution in multiple ways. You have 45 days to respond with a plan of action on how to fix this. Prisons are wildly overpopulated. They're up into the 170, 180% capacity, and it's very, very dangerous. It's understaffed. The prison system is really, really poor. That's currently what's happening right now. Back in 2006, they kind of sort of saw this coming, and they said we need to make some changes. And one of the things that they said we can make some changes is let's establish these structured sentencing algorithms. And essentially, let's do this. Let's find non-violent offenders, particularly drug crimes, and let's limit how much time that they serve. This was kind of in direct contrast to the war on drugs. So there's federal mandatory minimums for certain drug crimes, and we're trying to stop the flow of drugs. And so we have really harsh punishment for drug crimes. So that includes non-violent drug crimes. And what was happening is we were overpopulating our prisons. So in 2006, they created a worksheet and they gave it to all the judges, and they say, judges, use this worksheet if you'd like. Okay. In 2013, they said, judges, you now must use that exact same worksheet. You have to use it, unless you have some sort of like really extraordinary situation that you can justify. All right, so what happened to the total amount of confinement in, the average confinement in offenders? So this is when it passed, so this is weekly data in the total confinement of just the average, just raw data, average time served in months for nonviolent drug and property crimes. This is the 2006 the algorithm became voluntary, and this is in 2013 when it became presumptive. What do you see happen?
What's the difference?
Yeah, so you have this discontinuity, right? So you have this discontinuous break in time served, right? So people are serving much higher time. They establish this algorithm that everyone has to follow, and all of a sudden, people are serving much, much less time.
Why does the middle section trend up?
So it looks like it kind of almost goes down and trends up and comes back down a little bit.
Okay.
So when we fit a nonlinear line to this, that's what we see as it goes down, it comes up, and it goes down a little bit. The answer is long and it's complicated, and I'm going to give it to you anyways. Okay. So, in Alabama, if you serve anything, if you're sentenced to anything over a year, you must serve in the state penitentiary. You have to serve the time in the state penitentiary. Okay? Anything under a year, you can serve in the local county jails. Who pays the bill if you serve in the local county jail? The county does. The county does. Who pays the bill if you serve in state? we all pay the bill. Right? So what's happening here, what's happening in 2007, 2008, 2009, how's the economy? Not great. Right? And so why are sentences trending up?
To get them in the state penitentiary.
Yeah. Does that upset you? It should.
Yeah.
It should. Again, you should serve time, right? Like, so if you're convicted of a crime, you should serve the appropriate time. But are you super comfortable with the fact that judges are manipulating your convicted felon sentences so that counties don't have to pay for it? I feel like that should bother you. It bothers me. And I feel like it should bother you. And the reason that we know this is because I'm writing this paper with with a former judge who knows lots of judges and who have had these conversations before. And what happens, particularly in smaller communities, is the judge has an office in the same building as the county commissioners, right? And so the judges are keenly aware of the available space in their local jails and keenly aware of how much it costs to house them. Because this is just stuff they chat about at lunch. So our hypothesis, and this is a future paper that we're writing, is that judges are over-sentencing as the economy gets bad to force people into, basically to share the cost of their prisoners with the entire state, as opposed to concentrating the cost into the local community.
Did you see accumulation of like a year plus 1 day type of sentences?
Yeah, so there should be some sort of like clumping, right around there. I need to look at that. We haven't looked at that, because you would expect that. You would expect that to be the case. You should see some sort of clumping at it, that right at that cutoff. The other thing that we see it happens too is there's this thing that we allow in Alabama called a split sentence. So a judge could sentence you to 2 years total confinement. But a lot of times the judges don't like that because once you get into the prison system, the judges lose control. So 2 years might be with good time and good behavior in prison might only be 3 months. So there's this alternative which is called a split sentence. So, and the split sentence says that the judge could sentence you for 2 years again, but split over 1 year in prison and 1 year on probation. So you live at home on probation for the second year and you serve the first year. But what that does is that allows you to, you have to serve that entire year in prison. So once you get in prison, the Department of Corrections can't shorten that down. And Corrections is always looking for ways to get people who are rehabilitated out of prison because it's overcrowded and it's expensive. But judges sometimes don't like that. And they want to ensure that the person is going to be in prison for the time that they said that they're going to be in prison, so they'll do a split sentence. That's important because per Alabama statute, a split sentence can be served at either state penitentiary or in the local jail. Right, so it doesn't have this year stipulation on it. And so what we find, and this is a different conversation for a different day, but essentially what we find is that once they enact this presumptive sentencing guideline, so it pushes all the sentences down, initially what happens is that overburdens the local jails, right? Because it's pushed all these sentences down. So how do judges respond? They start splitting the sentences. And the split sentence still fits within the algorithm that they're required to fit into, but now what can they do? They can send in the state again. It's pretty messed up. But we're working on it, right?
So do you know what happened with the spike in the 2012 or 2000?
Elections?
Uh,
Yes, I
No, this is weekly level data, so it's pretty noisy, right? So this, I don't remember, there was a very severe sentencing. It was a high profile case and the judge gave something like 999 years or something. And they hold they're in like the Guinness Book of World Records for the longest criminal sentence. It was like posturing, it was like a media event. Right, so and I think that pulls that weekly average up. I think is what happened there. Any other criminal sentencing questions? I love it.
Super interesting.
So this is what we're trying to do. Is we're trying to establish these causal relationships, right? So we're using these discontinuities in the data, and this kind of like, did the people who made this worksheet, did they think were they trying to predict what kind of effect it was going to have in the future? We argue that it is an exogenous change, okay? But still, we don't always get these nice, clean regression discontinuities that we can that we can exploit. Sometimes we use a different technique called difference in difference. We use panel data. All right, so the idea of a difference in difference regression is that you have non-random treatment that is associated with pre-existing trends. Right, so this violates OLS. It's not a random assignment of the whatever it is. The kick in the chest is not randomly assigned. There is some sort of assigning mechanism to the kick in the chest, but we can figure out and we can control for how that assignment happened, and then isolate the effects still. Essentially what we do is we're going to follow the same state over time, and we're going to look at how that state changed, and then we're going to compare it to a group of states over the same period of time that didn't change. We do this in a paper entitled Depolicing, Stephen Rushton and I did in 2017. And what we did here is we looked at Department of Justice intervention in local police departments. Okay? If there's evidence that a police department is behaving poorly with kind of systemic problems, kind of like what was happening in Ferguson, Missouri, there is a statute in the U.S. Code that says that the Department of Justice can investigate that police department. And they can, if the results of the investigation suggest rampant misconduct, they can sue the local police department. This happened to Ferguson. It happened in L.A. after Rodney King. It's happened a bunch of times. Okay, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, what is the effect of this Department of Justice investigation on the way that police arrest people, on crime rates and stuff like that? Is Department of Justice, are they randomly evaluating law enforcement agencies? No, right? It's very, very non-random who gets assigned. There's usually some event that makes us think we should probably investigate them, like Rodney King, like Ferguson. Okay? Can we still establish a causal line even though it's non-randomly assigned? The way that we do this is we try and control for the trends that led us to that random assignment and isolate the effect. Formally, the way that we do it is essentially you take two differences. Okay? So in this case, it's the crime rate after the event happens, and you compare that, so BD stands for like the bad department. So you look at the crime rate of the bad department after they're investigated, you compare that to the crime rate of that same department before it was investigated, before and after. But other things that were happening to drive that investigation, right? There's this pre-existing trend that's driving this, this investigation. So what we do is we then go through and look at good departments, and we track that same difference over the same time. So there is some sort of pre-existing trend that we're trying to capture in a set of control departments, and then we're taking those two differences and then differencing them.
So the good and the bad are both investigated?
No, so they are investigated,
Okay.
and we're calculating the crime rates before and after the investigation, and we're comparing that to before and after the investigation time period for the good departments.
Because you're trying to measure the effect of the investigation.
Trying to measure the effect of the investigation, but it's non-randomly assigned who gets investigated, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to take out other things that were happening to police departments at that time, generally, right? So we're trying to
the
basically...
economy improved, so you're going to see both of them move.
Yeah. So if the economy improved, if policing tactics improved, if general sentiment of society towards police officers gets better or gets worse, right? Because it's gotten worse. I think the last couple of years it's gotten worse. That will affect both the bad police department and the good police department in the same way. And if we just did this, what we think we're measuring as the investigation is the investigation plus other stuff that happened. So what we want to do is we want to measure this and then subtract this out, which is hopefully the other stuff that happened. Okay? And that gets us what we think to be a causal estimate. So what happened? What happens after the DOJ investigates departments? And what they do is they come with what's called a consent decree, and it's an agreement between the Department of Justice and the local municipality that says y'all need to do this set of things to stop being so terrible. Okay? Cops hate this crap. Right? Why? People generally don't like to be told how to do their job. My experience with police officers is they especially don't like to be told how to do their job, right? And so there's all sorts of like blowback that says you can't tell cops how to be cops, you can't tie their hands because they can't be effective peacekeepers if you're telling them how to live their lives, essentially. So what we find is that once these departments start to get investigated, property crimes increase. So essentially, what people predict, crime's going to go up because you don't allow cops to be effective cops anymore, so crimes are going to go up. We do see that crimes go up, but we see that effect only happens for about 5 years, and then it goes back to normal. So what we argue happens is, in the paper we're arguing is happening is there's some growing pains. Right, so the Department of Justice comes in and makes a bunch of changes, and a bunch of cops either have to learn how to do the paperwork better, or they leave, and you hire new people in who are more on board with the current, with the consent decree, and after 5 years or so, this effect goes away. And we say in the paper, having oversight over police officers is probably merits the cost associated with the increase in property crimes. Another example of difference in differences is looking at buying guns. So y'all might not realize this, but in a lot of states, if you go and try to buy a gun, they will sell it to you, then they'll put it in a safe for like 2 days if you're in Wisconsin, 14 days if you're in Hawaii, and you go back, you've already bought the gun, but you can't get it for some sort of specified period of time. Why do we do this? Passion crimes, anger, suicide, stuff like that, right? Actually, every state had a law from 1994 to 1998 with the Brady Handgun Prevention Act. Every state had a 5-day wait period. Alabama actually had a 3-day wait period after that expired, and they eventually got rid of it, so there's no wait period anymore. Okay. So what we're trying to figure out in this paper is how does this wait period affect, we call it a purchase delay, how does it affect homicides and suicides? So here's the variation in the different laws in the states, right? So if you have a lightly colored state like Utah, they have no purchase delay. Darker colored states have waits, de facto waits that occur because you have to get a permit. There's a bunch of different variation. So the idea is, can we establish some sort of causal relationship between purchase delays and gun-related homicides and suicides? So the way that we do this is we employ the same difference in difference technique. So we take, for instance, Alabama, and we compare Alabama's homicide and suicide rates before and after they have the purchase delay, and we compare that to a fixed set of states that didn't have a purchase delay over the same period of time, trying to capture that trend. What do y'all think are the results? Do purchase delays matter? Probably, maybe. So it turns out for gun-related homicides, it doesn't matter. Why do you think that is?
Because you're intent on killing someone, it doesn't matter if there's a gun or not.
So So we're looking only at gun-related homicides, right? So it has no effect on. So you would say like there's a substitution effect. If you make it harder for me to get a gun, then I'll just kill it with other means.
Or they get someone else's gun.
Or maybe so they get someone else's gun. What did you say?
It's not done with the legal gun.
Yeah. So the vast majority, and so I don't want to ruin your gun control ideologies here, but the vast majority of guns that are used to commit crimes are not recent purchases. They're not typically normal purchases from Walmart or from Cabela's or something like that. These are guns that are stolen. These are secondary market purchases. These are black market purchases. These are borrowed guns. So we have a big sector of society that says, hey, we need to control what's going on with guns, and I agree that we do. And then their solution is we need to attack the point of sale of firearms. And all the research shows, and this research is done by people who I know personally are super liberal and super hate guns, and they want guns to go away. And still, with all of that built-in bias that they have, the research still says that this is just most of these policies that look at the point of sale, that try to affect the point of sale, just don't work. We're talking like universal background checks.
Background checks do not work.
Background checks do not deter firearm-related homicides.
Because the person selling the illegal guns not doing a background check.
Yeah, so they're not running. So they're not running background checks. So this is pretty easy. It's pretty easy to get a gun without running a background check. Even in states that have universal background check laws, which is like if you and I were to transact a gun, I sold it to you, technically I would have to run your background check. But in practice, like, do you think people are actually running background checks in private sales? No, they are not, right?
The private sales, I think, is where it's at.
And
In
it's
Colombia, if you want to sell it, it has to first go back to the army. If I want to sell your gun, I have to first take it back to the army checks it in, and then I sell it to you, and then you have to check it out.
okay. Yeah,
So,
that might work better. That's not the way it works in the United States.
Just curious, you said that was homicides. Did the weight delay have any effect on suicides?
So yes, great question. So while there's very little that we can do at the point of sale to affect homicides, we actually find that gun-related suicides are there are some gun-related suicides that are deterred by these purchase delays, and here's the reason why. And I think it's like dark topics, but important nonetheless. So most of us know someone who has committed suicide or who has attempted to commit suicide, but we don't realize how many people that we know who have attempted to commit suicide, right? Lots of people attempt to commit suicide. You don't know it because we don't talk about it, and the attempt was non-fatal. Most suicide attempts are non-fatal. Only 8% of non-gun suicides are fatal. 8%. Contrast that to gun suicide attempts are like 85% fatal, right?
that's the one thing guns are effective at.
Handguns are really good at killing humans, right? That's really all that you use a handgun for, is killing humans, right? It's not great at shooting squirrels. I'd rather have a shotgun if I'm shooting squirrels. Big game, I want a rifle, right? Handguns are effective at killing humans. So what we see is that so in the context of this, what we see is that, so first of all, most suicide attempts are non-fatal except for the gun suicide. Second of all, most people who think about committing suicide, they have suicide ideation, and the suicide attempt usually sits within about 48 hours of each other. So you have the idea to commit suicide, and you attempt to commit suicide in a really small window, right? Additionally, most people who attempt, who have a near fatal but not fatal suicide, end up dying for reasons other than suicide. So basically what happens is that if we can disrupt the suicide ideation, suicide attempt flow, we will deter some suicides. I'm not saying all suicides, but we will deter some suicides. Even if a person goes to the store and buys a gun with the intent to commit suicide, they put the gun in the safe and they come back 2 days later, they still get the gun, and most of the time they do not use it to try to commit suicide, because all the suicide research suggests that it is a small window, that if you can get through the window, you usually can get some help and you can usually pass through the moment. Okay? So what we find, so this is a little bit different, it's called an event study. So basically what we do is we look at the effect of these purchase delays on suicides by year. Okay? So this is the effect, this is like the coefficient effect by year. And so what we see is that before, there's no effect, which is not what we would expect because the policy hasn't passed yet. This is just a test to show that we're not measuring something that we don't think we are. Then once the policy passes, you see gun-related suicides drop by an average about 5%. And then once these policies are repealed, like Alabama got rid of the purchase delay, you see that gun-related suicides creep back up again. Okay. So while there's very little that we can do to establish some sort of causal relationship between guns and homicides, there's actually a ton that we can do to address gun-related suicides. But we don't talk about gun-related suicides as much because it's taboo and it's not fun to talk about. and it's uncomfortable, like we all feel uncomfortable right now, right? Like, it's uncomfortable to talk about, but the numbers are that more people commit suicide by a gun per day than are shot or are fatally killed in a homicide. Before, so the Orlando shooting, I think 54 people died in the Orlando shooting. Before that shooting, there was never a mass shooting that killed as many people as self-inflicted gunshot deaths in any given day in the United States. It is a much bigger problem, gun-related suicides, than gun-related homicides. And you might argue, well, it's different, like it's a different problem, and I don't necessarily disagree. But there are plenty of steps that we can take to curb gun-related suicide that are pretty low cost. Do you have a question?
So like, yeah, just curious, like, what period of time is that looking at? Like, because I'm just thinking economics could be a factor that, you know, during a period of time where economically we're doing well, there's a less risk that certain types of people will commit suicide over. When there's an economic fallout, the suicide rate could, I mean, it's just one correlation.
Yeah.
Or,
So keep in mind, this is essentially, we're doing a difference in difference by year,
yeah.
right? So what we're doing is we're looking at Alabama suicides before and after they have the purchase delay, and we're subtracting out all the other states that didn't have a purchase delay at the same time.
Okay.
So unless we're looking at similar economies, we're going to difference that out, right? If we're looking at similar like geopolitical circumstances, that all gets differenced out. In addition to it, I've been framing all this as like single variable regressions, but we're doing multivariate regressions here. So we're including controls for employment, for the economy, for other sorts of gun-related laws. You know, we have like a nice set of controls of things that we're able to control for as well.
Are you able to even dive down deep enough to see, like, okay, we had 100 suicides. Of that, this is the time period, the number of people that purchased a gun in less than 48 hours committed suicide versus those that purchased it, maybe owned it for over 48 hours.
Yeah, so we're looking at state level aggregate suicide data, so we don't have individual level data. The death data, the CDC just doesn't give that out because it's individually identifiable and they want to protect our privacy. It's a good thing, right?
No, yeah.
But what we do know is there's other people who have done surveys, not us, there's other researchers who have done surveys, and they have shown that they have shown the proportion of folks who committed or attempted to commit suicide with a gun, how frequently were those recent purchases, and their numbers match very closely to what we would expect our numbers to be.
Makes sense. I was just curious.
No, that's a good question. So it requires kind of like a little bit different of a technique, but their survey data kind of corroborates the story that we're telling here. Right. Yeah, go ahead.
How did you stop? Like, you're looking for all these causation events.
Yeah.
Where did you say, like, I'm sure the guy who did this study on the military grade equipment, you know, they said, okay, this is, we found it. But how do you know that what you found is the actual cultural event?
So how do you stop like digging deeper and?
Exactly. How do you avoid going down the rabbit hole saying, well, maybe there's something else that affected my data?
So you get bored with projects, right? So this paper published December 2018. I had the idea for this paper and I started writing it when my son was 8 in December, he was 2. So this paper took 6 years. So, I mean, if we weren't going to come up with it in 6 years, you know, it's not. Like, we did a very careful job to come up with everything that we could possibly think of.
And it goes into the whole peer review.
So it goes to the peer review process. And actually in economics, what we would do is we post our papers before they're peer reviewed, just on like, you know, research database websites. And so they get a lot of foot traction that way. And so we get comments back from like random people, researchers and otherwise, and they go through and they read our papers as well. This paper had 4 authors on it. I feel pretty confident that we turned every stone that we could possibly think of, and then we sent it to 3 different journals before the journal it published in, and so that's 9 more reviewers, and so they turned a bunch of stones that we hadn't thought of, and then the set of referees that we got, 3 referees on the paper that we published it. We ended up publishing it, and they had a set of things that they wanted to look at. So surely there's another angle out there that we have missed, but we've hit probably 95% of anything that anyone who thinks about the topic could possibly think about. You know.
How long is that period? So after you publish it, took you 6 years, you published it. How long does it go under review until it's, I guess, accepted or?
Yeah. So usually. So the first journal that we sent it to, it was under review for about 6 months, and then they came back and said we don't want to publish it for these reasons. We addressed those reasons, took another 4 months or so, and then sent it back to another journal. They took less time, probably 3 months, and said we don't want to publish it for this set of reasons. Some of them are overlapping, and the ones that weren't overlapping that we thought had value, we addressed those, and then we sent it off again. I think so. I published in the 3rd journal that we sent it in. The 3rd journal, they took probably another 4 or 5 months, and they sent back a list of issues that they saw off the paper. We addressed those. We sent it back again. They came back with another set of issues that they thought that we had. We addressed those, and we sent it back.
So are those editors giving you?
It's a combination of editors and blind review process. So blind reviewers. So other people who work in the field, they'll read the paper and then they'll come up kind of like with the problems that they think that the paper has. And especially a paper like this that we figured would probably get some attention and it's pretty controversial. The journal editor was super careful, right? Like we had to be very, very careful with everything that we did. There was no we were not afforded any sort of like sloppiness in any sort of the analysis at all. So, I mean, like I said, it's not perfect, and let me be frank, no research is perfect, but I feel pretty confident that we're on to something here. Okay. Last method we'll talk about in a couple minutes, which is like only slightly less depressing, is a method called synthetic controls. Okay. So what happens when we have this violation of this assumption that we don't have enough variation in X? All right. So the big example is by a guy named Alberto Abadie. He's Spanish, and he has worked in this area called synthetic controls. And essentially the idea is, what if you're looking at a state, not like our purchase delays where lots of states pass purchase delay laws, but what if you're looking at some sort of event that only happened in one state? For instance, in California they passed Prop 99, which put huge restrictions on tobacco and tobacco consumption and sale. Okay, but it only happened in California. OLS violations or OLS assumptions are violated. You're only having one state change. Is that a sufficient amount of variation? Diff and diff doesn't work out great because you're only identifying off of the change in one state as opposed to multiple states, too many controls. So what he suggests is, let's do this. Let's use the observable characteristics that we know about California and all other states, and let's create what is called a synthetic counterfactual of California. All that's doing is it's taking a weighted average of a bunch of different states that say, this is what California looks like. California looks like 16% of Colorado, 7% of Connecticut, about 20% of Montana, 23% of Nevada, and 33% of Utah, in terms of tobacco use, right? Based on the other variables that we have, they have essentially written an algorithm through multiple regression analysis that says California is a mix of these states and these are the weights, okay? All right, so how good of a synthetic control is it? So what they do is they say this is cigarette sales, black line is actual California cigarette sales. This is the moment that Prop 99 passes. The dotted line is their synthetic control. So they're saying based on the available data that we have, we can make a state that looks like California based on these weights, and in this case it actually maps really closely. So then the method is, to get at the causal estimate, the method is, after this passes, let's keep drawing this line using these weights, and let's compare this to actual California. So we're making like a robot California, and let's compare that to actual California. And you basically just measure the average distance, the average difference, and that is the effect of the policy. Okay? So in this case, you see that Prop 99 led to fewer cigarettes consumed. Another really, really interesting subject, and this is where I'll end on synthetic controls, is the decriminalization of sex work. Probably not something that you've thought about, but something maybe that you should think about. sex workers actually face a very high murder assault rate, up to 30 times more than the general population. Right? And the reason is due to lack of client screening. Right? So historically, sex workers have not been able to pre-screen clients. They have to make split-second decisions about, is this a dangerous person or is this not a dangerous person? Those are difficult decisions to make. With the advent of mass media and the internet, a lot of these client screenings have gone indoors and have gone online. For instance, there was a site called backdoor.com, and what it did is it allowed, in order for clients to register on Backdoor, you had to link a Facebook account, a legit Facebook account. So then the sex worker could go through and look at the account of the client, the Facebook account of the client, and see, is this a normal person, or are they going to murder me, basically? And it allows, it's not perfect information, but it allows more information for them to make these judgment calls. And again, you might be thinking like, well, why do I care about this? Sex work is illegal in the United States, and this is kind of like this is like a taboo under the rug topic that we don't normally deal with. It is actually way more frequent than you might imagine. And there's been a lot of attack on sex work because of the sex slave trade, right? And so, I think I'm going there next. So, there was a situation where a daughter ran away from home, okay? And the family was searching for the daughter, and the mom eventually found the daughter under a fake name on the Backdoor website. So what does the mom do? Instead of saying, what has happened between our relationship where you felt like running away and becoming a sex worker was a better option than living at home, the mom says, it's Backdoor's fault that my daughter ran away, and so let's shut down Backdoor. Okay, so she lobbied successfully, and she lobbied and petitioned successfully for 2 different acts of Congress that essentially made these online sites illegal. It technically didn't make them illegal, but it did say that they could be held accountable for the transactions that happen on the website, which is a departure from the way that we typically regulate the internet right now. Right, so if you go on Craigslist and you go buy a boat and you go pick it up and it's not actually a boat, Craigslist is not liable, right? So it's like this, it's an intermediary market, they're not held liable, and we want that because we want websites like Craigslist and eBay to exist, and it's buyer beware, right? Because of this situation, because they thought it would help with the sex trade, they held these websites liable for what happens on their websites, which essentially made them impossible to run, and they immediately shut down. Okay. This legislation has had very, very bad consequences, right? So we see huge rates of rape and assault for sex workers. It's spiked again. It was going down and spiked again because all these websites have gone down. Their screening process that they used to be able to engage to online has now gone offline. It's gone on the streets, and it's not good. And again, you might not care about sex work. You might not think this is something that you should care about. But like, if you value people and human lives, and it's even people who don't look and talk or act like you should, I think you should care about this, and I think you should care about them. And so does Scott Cunningham. He does a lot of work on sex work. And he wrote, that's synthetic control paper. So he wrote a paper in 2018, and what they did is they looked, there was this weird circumstance where a judge in Rhode Island unexpectedly ruled to decriminalize indoor sex work in Rhode Island.
Unexpectedly ruled?
Yeah, so no one thought that it was coming. The judge didn't go on the news and say, this is a high profile case and I'm leaning this way or I'm leaning this way. It just kind of happened. It was a facet of the law. It was just kind of an intricacy of the law that they said, he's like, I have to decriminalize sex work, okay? So, what do? Only one state has decriminalized indoor sex work, and that is now Rhode Island. So they're going to use the same method, this synthetic control. Okay. So what they have here is, this is their, the dotted line is a synthetic Rhode Island, same method as the previous paper. This is actual Rhode Island. This is synthetic Rhode Island, actual Rhode Island. And this one here measures gonorrhea rates per cap for females, and this measures reported rates per cap. Okay. So what happens? You decriminalize sex work, and gonorrhea rates for women go down, and reported rapes of women go down. And there's all sorts of reasons why rapes might go down. So this might be actual rapes of the sex workers, but it also might be kind of like, and this is like, this is like cold, callous economists talking, but it might be like a substitution effect, right? So if you're allowed to easily engage in indoor sex trade, maybe you don't go out and rape someone, right? So there's kind of like a substitutability here, and they argue that it could either be that, or this could actually just be the rapes of the sex workers themselves go down. Again, pretty gnarly stuff to talk about on a Wednesday night. But this is the.
Totally need this presentation. Yeah.
But these are like, for me, these are important issues, right? These are important things that we need to be thinking about, and we need to figure out ways to get at these causal relationships. Because if we were just to look at, say, this line, we wouldn't know it's something else going on that's driving gonorrhea rates down, right?
Well, I was just thinking, like, do you ever compare against other countries that may have been passing, like, similar, like, legislation, like Portugal, legalized cocaine and stuff. I don't know.
Uh-huh.
I never followed up with, but I don't know how it affected their drug crime rate.
Yeah, so
there's the Netherlands. I think there's Denmark or Holland where they actually created, the government authorized, like, to regulate, like, a registration process for, like, if you're, legalize, like, sex workers, then they have, like, these apps, and it was the Netherlands, right?
Yeah.
Where everyone knows, like, you can put a blood profile on there, your health chart, and then you can get on the website, and then whoever wants to, like, work with you,
Yeah.
they'll pick you.
So typically, the short story in all economics is more information, no matter how gruesome the information is usually better,
Yeah.
right? Better passage of information across all parties usually leads to better transactions, right? We, of course, always want to withhold information because it feels like it gives us the upper hand a lot of times, but more information is almost always preferred. In terms of have people looked at Portugal, I think so. With the synthetic control, you have to be a little bit careful, because you have to ask yourself, how good of a control would Portugal be to, say, like Rhode Island, right? Like, how similar is Portugal to Rhode Island? Probably similar in some ways, probably more dissimilar in more ways than they are similar. But for instance, Abadieh did a paper looking at the effect of terrorism in the Basque Country in Spain. So there's this one region of Spain that has the Basque people in it, and they're like separatists, and there's this like, organized crime called ETA, and they send bombs off occasionally just because they want to separate from the rest of Spain. And so they've done this in international settings, but still in that paper they use other provinces in Spain as their synthetic control. But yeah, there are opportunities, and it works much better in Europe because they're all separate countries, but for lots of ways they're almost like similar. They're similar to states in the United States. So to conclude, some questions are easy to answer. Some are more complicated, but oftentimes the complicated questions are the ones that need answering the most. All right, and so this is kind of what we were engaged in. If y'all got questions, I have 1 minute.
Is the synthetic control more accepted? I don't know if it's because you said it last, but it just seems to be.
In terms of like mainstream economics, I would say it is less accepted than, say, like difference in differences. There are issues that still need ironing out.
Does it depend on how many other factors you're using to determine the synthetic? I mean, I would imagine it's way more complicated and time consuming to create that synthetic if you're doing it correct, like.
So the set of like common variables that you use to create the synthetic group, that will in large way determine how good of a synthetic control that you have. The other problem is hypothesis testing, right? So when we do like a typical OLS regression, right, we'll have a null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis, and we'll reject after certain cutoff levels. It's not clear how to do the hypothesis testing in synthetic controls. So the way that they do it right now is that they will take all the other states that are not included as the treatment state or the control states, or the synthetic states, and they will do the same analysis. So like, they will do this graph, but for every state that's not Rhode Island and the states that made this, okay? And then they will calculate the difference between these two lines. and then they will rank them. And the idea is, if this is a true effect, this should be out in the tail of the distribution. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
So it's a combination of this with the other formula.
Yeah, so in a sense, it's like hypothesis. It's kind of like a backdoor hypothesis testing, where you say, hey, let's look at Delaware, let's look at New Hampshire, let's measure the effect between the Rhode Island synthetic control and Delaware and New Hampshire and New York and New Jersey, and then you measure this average distance, and then you just rank them from top to bottom. And so, like, Rhode Island has a big difference, but all the other ones have little differences, or they have positive differences. And if you turn it on the side to create some sort of like distribution, you would expect to see, if this is a true relationship, you would expect it to see out in the tail of the distribution, right? But if it's near the mean, if this is what, like, if you just pick some random state and it looks similar to this, then you've probably got problems, okay? And that's a little bit more fringe right now, that, again, researchers are still ironing out.
Have you seen a big impact of things like big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning on your field?
Yeah, so we are slowly but surely integrating machine learning techniques. But much of what machine learning techniques is just kind of like applied regression analysis, right? So you have these machine learning techniques that are essentially just running high-powered regressions, right? So I was just doing, I don't remember what it was. I forget the name of it. A lasso. I was just doing a lasso machine learning technique for something unrelated. And essentially what it is it's just running regressions, but it is automating what variables that you put in. So it's putting them in and pulling them out and putting them in and pulling them out and putting them in and pulling them out until you find kind of like, you allow the data to find the story, which in some cases is really, really useful. In other cases, you need an underlying theory to drive that result. So yeah, we are moving there slowly, but we are a little bit, as a field, we like math and we like excessively complicated stuff, and so
The math is not going away; it's just being done much faster by somebody else. Or
Yeah.
something else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, but we are heading we are heading in that direction. We have entire conferences about how to integrate machine learning techniques and big data and stuff like that. And the cool thing that happens, I don't use R or Python because I'm old, but we have I know that there are economists now who work for like Yahoo and Amazon, and what they will do is they will in real time they will pull the data that Amazon gets, and it's constantly updating there. So they'll use Python to pull the data, and then they'll use R to analyze the data, and as more data comes in, it automatically updates the regression results and updates the implications for the models. And this is why Amazon and like Delta, they're able to so accurately price things, and they're so able to predict exactly what you want and the price that you wanted, because they're doing this in real time.
It's in our field, freight is starting to do that a lot. Where a lot of machine learning is just looking at the causation for freight, because freight varies so much.
No, I did an internship with C.H. Robinson. Do you know those guys? And I mean, this was a couple years ago, but back in the day, like, they barely even had a spreadsheet, a pricing spreadsheet, right? So I worked in less than truckloads, so LTL loads, and volume, right? So like the volume of the pallet matters and the density of the pallet matters, and it was really archaic even back then about how they would calculate these things. And they could have now, and they probably do, they could really easily now create some sort of machine learning technique, and with every single route in the United States and every single segment of every single route for every single load, they can they can maximize prices.
Yeah, it's happening.
On the calculation of the synthetic option, I'm concerned a little bit about overfitting on it.
Uh-huh.
You have 49 other states to work with, and the way that you tracked in the pre-time, I'm sure you're about to pull it up. Yeah, right there. So the way that you tracked prior to the event was almost perfect. So it just really looks overfit to me.
Uh-huh.
So how do you consider that? How do you know that that's a good synthetic?
So this is the criticism of that's the criticism of synthetic controls right now. So you'll notice that it's not. So it's only grabbing, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's only using 5 states, right? It allows the entire 51, include DC. Yeah, the entire 51 options, but in the end it only uses 4. And so how do you ensure it's not just overfitting? This is where it gets kind of complicated, right? So what they'll do is, like I said, that they will just kind of be like, well, how do other states look, right? Like what if instead of California, what if we make this Texas? Or what if we make this Nevada? Or what if we make this Oregon? And then we say, if there's some sort of systematic pattern, like every single state is looking like California, then there's an underlying problem that we haven't figured out yet. But if like Texas is down here, then it goes up here, and Oregon maps a little bit, then it goes down and it goes up, then we feel pretty confident that we've correctly fitted this.
Okay.
Any other questions?
This is awesome presentation.
All right, let's be done.